Okay, so tonight we're talking about divine rebellions. And so the last time we met, we talked about the human rebellion in the garden, and we'll talk a little bit more about that on Sunday morning. But there were also divine rebellions in the Old Testament. And so the pre-session question, the first one that I asked is, what questions come to mind when you read about a talking snake in the garden?
I live with one.
Talking animals the norm.
It had to be.
I think that's a valid question. It's like, did the dog talk to you? Like, was there some form of communication that like just we haven't? I know that with the Tower of Babel, all things spoke different, but like pre-Tower of Babel, did like even the animals and people talk? Like,
Cause they understand, like Dr. Doolittle, cause they understand
Yeah,
each other,
like-
maybe, or, how did that look?
if it was abnormal, it would have been made a little bit bigger of a deal. That like, oh, this one snake is speaking, therefore it's abnormal and something to not be trusted.
Yeah, I have heard people say, and there's no biblical basis at all for this, but I've heard people say that in the garden they think that animals could talk, or that Adam and Eve could understand the animals and vice versa. The only two instances in the Bible where it seems that an animal speaks is here. And does anybody else? Balaam's donkey
Yeah,
spoke.
that's the way we've been a pain though.
So, yeah, and so that I think that's a question, and hopefully we'll kind of maybe answer that tonight as we go through this. But I do think, when people, especially people that are new to the Bible, and that in itself is it's hard for me to wrap my mind around, because I've been exposed to the Bible my whole life. But if you're somebody that's new and you're opening up the Bible for the first time, within the first 3 chapters, you're seeing a talking snake. And so I think that is a big obstacle for a lot of people. And what I hope we'll look at tonight is maybe it's not as big as an obstacle as we think it is, but the problem may be that English translations don't do the Hebrew the justice that it should. And you'll see what I'm talking about later. But anybody else have any other kind of thoughts? You guys in virtual land, Jimmy in San Francisco at the Brooklyn Bridge, San Francisco Bridge. Sorry. Yeah, whatever. So San Francisco Golden Gate Bridge. Sorry.
Not good at math or geography.
Yeah. So it would surprise many people. I think that this serpent isn't what we first might think it is. In John's, at least I'm not a cat. Okay. John identifies this serpent, and we talked about this in our Revelation study. John identifies him as the slanderer and the adversary. And so that's one thing I want to make clear is Satan is actually not a name. It's a job description. Okay. It actually means the adversary. And so you may hear me, because Michael Heiser does this, and I have kind of adopted it at times, but you'll hear me say the Satan. And it's because it's not a name, it's a job description. And so John identifies him as the slanderer in Revelation 12:9. And then in Genesis 3:1, we have some hints in Hebrew about what Adam and Eve are actually seeing. Okay, and so Genesis 3:1 says, "Now the serpent was more crafty than any other beast of the field that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, 'Did God actually say, you shall not eat of any tree in the garden?'" And so there's some important things to consider when we look at this English word serpent. First is that the word other here, where it says, "Now the serpent was more crafty than any other beast of the field," that word other is not in Hebrew, okay? In a lot of translations, that's going to be in italicized because it's something that the translators added to try to help make sense of things. And so literally it says the serpent was more crafty than any beast of the field, right? And so already there's a possible hint that this is not a beast of the field. This is not something that God created when he made the creeping things and the beast from the ground and those kind of things. This is already kind of an other kind of being. The second is the word itself for serpent in Hebrew is nahash. Okay, and so what's happening here? The root letters are N, CH, and SH. And that is important reading Hebrew because originally Hebrew contained no vowels. And so when they wrote a word, usually Hebrew words have 3 consonants in them at least. And in those consonants, there's some vowels in there. And so as you read as a Hebrew reader, you would have to kind of decide what word you were reading and plug those vowels in. And so what happens with this word serpent, you had to think about all those words that could be formed from the root. And so N, CH, and SH could make 3 possible words. Right? The first is it could create the word nahash, and that is a noun that meant serpent or snake. So that's what we're seeing in our English translations. That's how they've chosen to translate that is serpent. The second is it could create the word nohesh, which is a verb meaning divination. And so to think about that, it would be like an oracle, somebody communicating with the beyond, right? You're divining. There's divination. And then finally, it could create the word nachash, which is an adjective that means shiny or brilliant. Okay? And so when a Hebrew would read about this rebel in the garden, all 3 of those words would come to mind because you have to kind of decide what this is. And so the point here that Michael Heisner makes is this is kind of a triple entendre. And so as you're reading this, that being is kind of all of these things. And so we'll talk about the serpent part here in a second, but that divination of I'm talking to something spiritual holds true because this is a heavenly being. Satan was a heavenly spiritual being, right? And even you think back to like Greek mythology, they had oracles, right? That would communicate to them, that would give them wisdom from that you couldn't get on earth, right? And then also the word shiny, and we'll talk about here in a second. But these 3 words are also used elsewhere in the Old Testament to describe other divine beings. And so in Ezekiel 1:7, it's used to describe the 4 living creatures that are around God's throne. And the way it describes those 4 living creatures is that they sparkled like burnished bronze. In Isaiah 6, again, we have these beings around God's throne, and they're called seraphim. They are winged serpent-like beings that have human features. Okay, so Isaiah sees them flying around. He uses the word seraph, and you're going to see how that connects to this serpent language. in a second in Numbers. But he sees these beings flying around, but they hand him something with a hand. And so that's kind of like this serpent-like being, but they also have human features. The I am suffix, when we talk about seraphim, or cherubim, or even Elohim that we've already talked about, that I am suffix, im, is how you make a word plural. And so the singular of seraphim is seraph. And that is the same word that's used to describe the fiery serpents in Numbers chapter 21. So in Numbers chapter 21, there are these snakes that come and bite the children of Israel while they're in the wilderness, right? And so if they were to bite you, your skin would burn. And so that's the idea of shining ones or burning ones. They were poisonous snakes. And so to save them, what does God do? He tells Moses to make a bronze shining serpent, brass, copper, shiny metal. And that serpent is then hung on a pole, and it's crucified, right? It's hung on a pole, and everyone that looks at that serpent lives. And so now we can go forward with that into John's gospel, right? And Jesus said, just as Moses lifted up the serpent, I'm going to be lifted up. And we know that Deuteronomy talks about everyone that hangs on a tree is cursed. And that's what Jesus becomes for us on the cross is our curse. And so in him, our sin is put to death, right? That's one way the Bible talks about salvation. That's one of the pictures. And so Jesus' death reverses the curse that is caused by this adversary. Does that make sense? By kind of following along? Okay. So this would help explain why Eve wasn't surprised to see a talking serpent, because it most likely wasn't just a snake that we think about. And it wasn't an animal of the field, but rather a divine creature with human features. And even the part about you'll crawl on your belly. I know people have talked about, well, snakes used to have legs. And actually, one of the interesting things about that is in a boa constrictor, not a boa constrictor, in a python, like the one that we used to have, near the back of it, there are what they call false legs that it uses to help move. And people have said, well, snakes used to have legs and then they lost them at some point. But even that crawl on your belly is a Hebrew idiom for being taken down. Like in the Bible, where it talks about pride coming before a fall, right? And so that's the way God talked to kings of other nations. I'll take you down to your belly. That's like a humiliation type language. And so doesn't mean that it's literal, in other words. And so the serpent's crime was that he didn't want Adam and Eve to join the family. Right? God created them. He created a heavenly beings. All of them are part of his family. And so Satan doesn't want them to join the family or be part of the family business. And so he rebels. He became prideful, and he tries to take dominion for himself. And so Isaiah 14 describes this rebellion and describes him as someone who wanted to ascend above the host of heaven. I've got that here. It says, how fallen from heaven, how you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of the dawn, how you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. Above the stars of God, I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the far reaches of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. But you are brought down to Sheol, to the far reaches of the pit. And so Isaiah here is using imagery from Canaanite mythology. So we have to remember, as people were trying to describe things that they couldn't see all the time, you can't see these beings. A lot of times they would say, well, they're the stars. And so that's why we have this star kind of language here. And so Isaiah is describing the Hillel ben Shahar. think I said that right, Sahar, or son of the dawn. And so in Latin, the way they translate this in Latin is with two words, lux, which means light, and pharos, which meant to carry. And so that's where we get Lucifer, okay? It's a Latin translation of son of the dawn. And so in Canaanite mythology, this was the planet Venus, okay? Venus is the first light in the sky in the morning. It rises before the sun rises, okay? And so this light wants that position of authority. It wants to be first. It wants to be the light of the day, but it's overtaken by the sun. So that's kind of what's happening here. And so because of Satan's rebellion and deception, that serpent is banished from the garden along with Adam and Eve. And so Ezekiel 28:14 talks about it this way. You are an anointed guardian cherub. I placed you. You are on the holy mountain of God. In the midst of the stones of fire you walked. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created till unrighteousness was found in you. In the abundance of your trade, you were filled with violence in your midst, and you sinned. So I cast you as a profane thing from the mountain of God, and I destroyed you, O guardian cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. And so just a really quick side road here. In Genesis, the Satan is a snake-like creature in the garden. And so it's very similar again to the language that's found in Isaiah that's used to describe the seraphim. We kind of looked at that. And this is language that the Egyptians would have understood. Okay? And so serpents in Egyptian mythology, in their cosmology, about trying to describe the supernatural, trying to describe gods and other beings, they use serpents for throne guardians. And so that's why in Egyptian iconography, you'll see a staff and it'll have a serpent's head on it. When you think about the headdresses that the pharaohs wore, they always have a serpent, right? And that's because they were guarding the pharaoh or guarding the king. And so it often featured a snake. However, in Ezekiel, the Satan is called an anointed guardian cherub. All right. And so the cherubim are not serpent-like creatures. They are a mixture of human and beast. Okay. And so in Ezekiel 10, they have the head of a man, they have the head of a lion, they have the head of an ox. They have 4 wings instead of 6. And so their role is basically the same. They both function as throne guardians. And so the question is, why do they look different? It's because this language in Ezekiel, whereas Isaiah would have been understood by the Egyptians, in Ezekiel, he uses language that the Babylonians and the Mesopotamians would have understood. Okay? He's using their iconography. And so in their cosmology, the throne guardians were beasts. And so you see that on pyramids and different things, ziggurats, those kind of things from that time. In both cases, God is using the things they associated with God to speak about who he is. Does that make sense?
Kind of when we went through Exodus and the plagues that he did on them was towards our counterfeit God.
Yes.
Like, you believe in the God of the river, so I'm going to turn it into blood. You believe in the God of this, so I'm going to bring this pestilence on you.
Yes. And
so he's using that.
Yep. And so the way I like to put this is we forget that the Old Testament and the Israelite people were supposed to be a light to the other nations, right? And so the Old Testament is not only a revelation about who God is to Israel, but it's also an apologetic to those other nations about this is the real God. You guys are following false gods, gods that you've invented, and this is the God that you're looking for. Okay? And so what he's communicating about himself is that God is holy, that he is powerful, that Yahweh is the ultimate authority, and so the path to him is guarded. We can't come to God on our own terms. That has been true of human kings as well, right? When you think about human kings throughout history, think about the book of Esther. What does she tell Mordecai? I can't go before the king without being called, right? He'll kill me if I come without him calling me. And so that also holds true for the creator of the universe, the king of the universe, Yahweh. We have to come on his terms. He's the one that has to invite us into the throne room, into his presence. And so these were powerful throne guardians that prevented anyone else from coming near. And that is why Isaiah in the book of Isaiah is freaking out. Woe is me. I am a man of unclean lips. Why is he afraid? Because my eyes have seen the king. I'm in his presence and I don't belong here. And so that's prohibited. And so his eyes have seen the king of the earth. Okay, so does that make sense? I think that's fascinating because I don't think we think about the Israelites being this light, and of course we know they failed most of the time, but still that apologetic is in there where God is trying to communicate to us in terms that we can understand, and He's doing that for other nations.
It's kind of like where Paul was when Paul went to, he says,
Yeah,
you've got all these things around, and you've got one for the unseen God. Well, let me tell you about him. That's the one true one.
yeah,
So
exactly.
using in a kind of like when Steve and them were here, our first missions conference where he talked about they had the people they were talking with or part of, they had to get the creation story correct to them before they could even present the
Yeah,
gospel.
that's what I
They
was
believed
gonna
in
say.
sticks and believed in all these different.
If you remember when Ben was here, and talked about going to a place and they have their creation story and what they think, what they think happened. And basically you're plugging your God into that, saying this is the true God, and we don't have to wonder what happened. He tells us about himself. He reveals himself to us. He doesn't leave us to guessing and trying to figure it out, grasp our way to him. He's revealing himself. And so in Genesis 3, we also have the first glimpse of the gospel. That's Genesis 3:15, and you've probably heard me say that that's the proto-evangelion. That's the first gospel, where it talks about the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent and that conflict that they have, and that the seed of the serpent would bruise his heel, but the seed of the woman would crush the serpent's head. And so we know the offspring of the woman is humanity, but ultimately it's Jesus, right? The Messiah. But the question is, who are the offspring of the serpent, the enemy? In John's gospel, as we've been talking about and going through, it's anyone that opposes Christ, anyone who stands against God's plan of redemption, what God has provided. And in Genesis, we will actually see some attempts to interfere with that plan. And so we see the wickedness and evil that began to spread all over the earth by the time we get to Genesis 6. One of my professors at Reformed Baptist Seminary wrote a book called Where Sin Abounds, Grace Abounds Even More, taken from Paul, but he goes through the Old Testament and talks about the spread of sin. Really good book. But in Genesis, we see the Lord saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he made man on earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and the birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. And so we see that evil spread, but what we may not notice is what helped humanity's wickedness come to a head. There was another rebellion that mirrored this human wickedness and evil that is spreading through humanity, and we see it in the verses before. So Genesis 6:1-4 says, when man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. That's going to be key later. When the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. And so my next question for you guys this week was this. What have you heard, and what do you think about the sons of God and the Nephilim mentioned in Genesis chapter 6?
What I know now, what I know before I listened to
Either way, yeah. What did you think before? I mean,
Well, I always
you
heard
heard
two different things. One was the fallen angels. You know, I've heard that, the fallen angels. And the other one was, they talk about the son of God was the line of Seth and the line of Cain.
Okay.
They tried, the human, you know, that was, which doesn't read interpretation wise as well in there as fallen angels or heavenly beings coming in.
Right.
So, but
Anybody?
even before Hazara, that's the two I'd heard.
Yeah. Anybody want to add?
Well, I've heard more about it in the past years listening to you than the 74 years before that.
Okay. This is, yeah. This is,
Seriously.
yeah. It's, and it's, I think this stuff is interesting.
I do too. I'm enjoying it. I'm glad you're doing it.
This is one of those, I saw a meme the other day, and I can relate to this meme, but it was like, I don't want to talk about, it's like somebody going to Thanksgiving dinner, and it's like, I don't want to talk about anything, but if you want to talk about the Nephilim, you know, I'm open to that.
8 hours
Yeah.
later.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, this story is about the sons of God. And really you talked about two. I've heard a third theory. There's the Seth lineage theory. And that's basically that, after Cain kills Abel, right? Adam and Eve have multiple children, but the Bible mentions Seth by name, as the next sons. And so that theory talks about how there is a righteous line and an unrighteous line, and those two mingle together, and then you have these men of renown. And so that is that idea of mixing righteousness and wickedness. But that really does read into the text. And the reason is because there's no prohibition yet on who can marry who, right? And this is what people have problems with, because obviously brothers and sisters at this point had to be married and have children because that's all there were, right? And so there's no prohibition yet on marriages. There's not even nations really at this point, right? And so later on in Israel's history, there's going to be, for Israel's future, there's going to be prohibitions from marrying people in other nations. And we know that was because the temptation to follow the gods of those other nations, but that doesn't exist at this point. And it's really hard I'll go back to the text, really hard to kind of justify, well, there's a righteous line and an unrighteous line or a wicked line. First of all, because we've all sinned, right? There's none righteous. But second of all, how does that produce mighty men who are of renown? And so that's kind of a question. The other theory that probably most of you hadn't heard is the king theory. And so that is this theory that there are kings that kind of start to rise up at this point, and they take for themselves daughters, and it's the idea of polygamy and that kind of thing. And so they become men of renown, and they're princes that they have. become men of renown, and they're wicked, and that's what leads to the flood. Again, I really don't see that doesn't seem to be the plain reading of the text.
Why does it say the sons of God stopped? They only had one son. True son.
The sons of God, well, because it's also a time lapse. Does that make sense? Like, you're not seeing, we don't know how much time is passing here. And so Adam and Eve did have more sons. And
No,
so,
she's talking about the sons of God there.
Yeah,
where-
So if
it's
you-
the sons of God,
if you
that's
thought
like
of-
the sons of Adam.
yeah, so if you thought of the Cain and Abel theory, that would be more sons that they would have had. But we'll talk about what the sons of God mean.
Please,
Yeah,
because you'll do a better job explaining to her than I can.
yeah, and so going back to
Well,
the,
because I understand it. I can't explain it to somebody.
so going back to the king
Make sense?
theory, really the problem would be polygamy, right? And so, again, we have a problem because polygamy was practiced by the patriarchs. Abraham, Jacob, even, Solomon, King David, they all had polygamous relationships, multiple wives, and they weren't judged in that practice. And we've talked about that before. This is how the Bible has descriptive text and prescriptive text. And so they weren't judged in that, even though that was not ideal. That's not really God's plan. He wants one man, one woman. But they did that, and the result wasn't a flood. Does that make sense? So why would that justify a flood here? And so it's best to let the Bible kind of inform us about who those sons of God are. And so in Job, they are the ones that go before God, and they're the Elohim that go before God, and along with them comes the adversary, Satan, right? And so when we think about sons of God, you're right. He only has one son. And even in that, son doesn't mean what we think it means, right? Because Jesus was never birthed. He was never created. And so the title, when we talk about Jesus being God's son, we're talking, again, God does
In
this.
an earthly.
Yeah, God does this all the time, using pictures that we can grasp to get who he is.
So because we're so finite and he's so infinite, he dumbs it. I can say he dumbs it down.
Huh?
Explain it to me like
Well, explain to me like I'm there.
And God does that.
Yeah.
But we often want to read it, and I know you'll hate me for saying this. We often want to read it more literal, and he's drawing us a picture. And so when we talk about the sonship of Jesus, what God is getting at is the Son has all the same rights as the Father, right? That's what he's getting at, is the Son is equal in rights and authority and to the Father. And so he's not his quote unquote son because he was never created. Same thing can be said about the spiritual beings that God creates, right? Just like the same thing could be said about humanity. And we've talked about this before. Like when people say, well, we're all God's children, they're not really wrong because God is our origin. He's the one who created us. But Christians have a special adopted relationship into God's family that's different, that's unique from just being generally called God's children. The same thing can be said about these sons of God. They were created by God. And so in that aspect, they're sons of God. Does that make sense? And so this is why Peter and Jude, when we talk about these sons of God being those spiritual beings, or what they will be called in the New Testament, oftentimes is going to be angels, right? Both Peter and Jude associate the angels who sin against God with the flood account. And that's key to some of this. So 2 Peter 2:4-6 said, "For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment, If he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly, if by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, he condemned them to extinction, making them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly. And then Jude also links this rebellion to the flood account. Now, I want to remind you, although you once fully knew it, that Jesus, who saved the people out of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed those who did not believe. And the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day, just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality. And so that's what Jude is attaching this to. He's saying that humans were judged because they acted in sexual immorality in the same way that angels committed some kind of sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire, served an example by undergoing the punishment of eternal fire. Okay? And so Peter and Jude say these sons of God committed some kind of sexual transgression. And so this is why they will be judged on the day of the Lord, because there was this unnatural thing that they did, not staying within their bounds, what God created them for. And here they also include some details from First Enoch, or the Book of Enoch. And so I need to do a little disclaimer here. The Book of Enoch was not part of the Old Testament canon. I'll say that again. The Book of Enoch was not part of the Old Testament canon. It's not part of the Hebrew Bible, but it did help inform their worldview of how things happened, what the history of the world was. And so there were some parts that they referred to and interacted with in Jude and 2 Peter. In First Enoch, the Watchers, instead of using angels or Elohim and Enoch, they're called the Watchers. And they wanted to, and does anybody know where else we see the term Watchers? The book of Daniel. Okay, so that's what Daniel talks about, the Watchers. The Watchers wanted to help humanity by sharing advanced knowledge. And so they teach humanity how to make weapons of war. They teach them about metallurgy, about sorcery, astrology, and chemistry. And instead of helping humanity, what ends up happening is they cause more wickedness and corruption because they've taught them how to do these things. And so along with that, along with teaching them those things, they also wanted to create their own image bearers. And so remember last week when we talked about God in the plural, Elohim, God said, let us, plural, create man in our image. But then when we get to the very act of creation, the verb was in the singular. And so only Yahweh does the action. That's how the Septuagint, sorry, I messed up. Where am I at? Yeah. In Enoch, the Watchers have sexual relations with the women, and they create a hybrid kind of divine / human being. And so those offspring were giants, became giant and mighty warriors. And so that's how the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation that Jesus would have read, that's how the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, translates the word Nephilim. Instead of Nephilim, it talks about giants being in the land and creating giants. And so these giants in the book of Enoch, they began to lay waste to everything. They rape, they commit cannibalism, they do all of these nasty, evil, wicked things, and they influence people that they're conquering, and that evil begins to spread even more. And so God then sends the flood to cleanse the earth of that corruption. And so in Enoch, to go a little bit further, and I won't get into much of this, if you want to get into this and go down this rabbit trail, you can. Heiser's got some really good stuff on it. But in Enoch, demons are the departed spirits of those dead Nephilim. The flood killed them, and since they're not human or spiritual, totally, they're kind of a mix. Their disembodied spirits then begin to roam the earth looking to be re-embodied, okay? Looking for something to jump into, right? And so that's why we see in the New Testament, them being in the pigs, being in the people that are demon possessed, those kind of things. And so now the question is about, well, what happens after the flood? The Bible does mention giants again, does mention the Nephilim, the Anakim, and the Rephaim. And so here in Genesis 6, we're told that they were in the land in Noah's days and also afterwards, post-flood. And so the idea is this happened anytime the sons of God came into the daughters of men. And so there has been more than one of these angelic rebellions, as we will see. And so in Genesis, these sons of God were trying to basically reformulate Eden in their own way. They wanted the human and divine to coexist. And so they took measures to try to make that happen. They presumed to know better than God, and they had their own plan and agenda, and so they're punished for that. And so now the big question is why does this matter? And so I'm going to read a quote here. This is by Heiser, whose study that we're doing. The prophetic curse on the serpent and divine transgression that followed are the early stages of what theologians call spiritual warfare, the battle between good and evil, the long war against God and his people. It's a war fought on battlegrounds in two realms, the seen and the unseen. Okay? And so when Paul is talking about spiritual warfare, about principalities, powers, darkness, those kind of things, we're going to get there. But we have to realize that this wasn't a New Testament kind of new thing, but this started way back from the very beginning. And so that's kind of the point and where we're heading with this. So now, if someone asked you about the serpent in the garden, what new insights would you be able to discuss or share in your conversation? Hopefully something.
English sucks.
Yeah,
It's a language, to put it bluntly.
yeah. Well, I mean,
When it comes to translating into other languages that are more complex than English, it's a very simplified language. And so it loses a lot of the subtlety and a lot of detail because it's very hard to translate word for word what they mean from the original text. And so a lot of context gets lost on this. Even something as simple as, like you said, the of.
Yeah.
I mean, two letters get added in, and suddenly that changes the entire everything you pull from that text.
Yeah.
And so, English being as human as a language as it is, that's as good as we can get. And so it can often lead us into the wrong direction and the wrong understanding of it. And so it requires us to get that full context of this situation. You can't, if somebody just goes off and starts talking about, well, your Bible talks about talking snakes and this, and this, that to try to devalue what Scripture is talking about, it's like, hold on a second, it's deeper than that.
Yeah.
And so it opens up another conversation that can lead into deeper situations.
Yeah, and that almost falls into the same thing of, tell me about the God you don't believe in, and I'll tell you why I don't believe in that God either.
Mm-hmm.
That's often the whole conversation.
Yes.
This is what I've been told about God. This is what I've been told about the Bible, and I don't believe that. And if people would slow down and have a conversation, they'll figure out. Oftentimes, neither do we. I mean,
Well, so it's two things. One thing is, again, and I think you saying tonight helps me a lot on that part, is the Bible is literal and it's not literal. It's literal, it's the word of God, but like, when it says in the Bible that Jesus was a lamb of God, well, Jesus wasn't a lamb, he didn't become a lamb or a lion, but it does give us a picture of, God says, okay, this is what it looks like, this is what it is, and so that's what it is here. The other part of it is, I'm not sure how well it would go in certain parts of this county having this kind of conversation.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. And I
Without
do,
me calling it a Herrick.
and I do want to kind of,
or
I do want to add some a little bit to what Dustin said, because at the same time, when we say the English sometimes doesn't do the Hebrew justice, well, we can't walk away with and say it misses the message.
right.
Because it doesn't. And so we have to be clear and kind of hold those up at the same time and realize our language might be limited and our understanding might be limited because we're so far removed from that culture and context. It would be no different than, there are kids today that never knew about the Twin Towers, right?
Right.
Yeah, because they didn't exist.
Or, did you see the video where the professor brought out a regular clock and asked his students to tell him what time
Right.
it was? And none of them got it right.
Yeah, and you've seen.
And yet we don't think about that. They can't.
Or giving them a rotary phone and tell them, make a phone call.
Right.
And
So it's the same thing.
yeah, it's kind of the same thing. And so some of those things that people take for granted that, well, they'll know this. Eventually it gets to a point where, well, there's something a little bit lost and you have to do a lot of deeper studying. So I'm very thankful for language nerds, because I can't do that stuff. That dive really deep into those words and are looking, not only how does the Bible use this word, but how did people that were writing at that same time,
To those people at that time.
yeah, how do those people, how would they have used those words? And that way you can have a better understanding of what the word means.
Well, I think making sure that when we're speaking to people, if we're making sure to point out that God is especially in several different places in the Bible, he is using more, playing on people's imaginations for explanations in the same way that we would explain to a child. And so we want to take serpent so literally, but it's a multifaceted word that means all those different things.
Yeah.
And being able to explain, just like when you're speaking to a child, we are children in our knowledge compared to God.
Yeah.
Way less than children. But so having that new knowledge now, we can explain, it's like serpent, yes, means serpent, but it also can mean a deceiver. And, we say a lying snake now.
Yeah.
Culture has brought it back around to that.
Yeah. And it's like, I'm working on my sermon for Sunday, haven't got it finished yet, but even this afternoon when I was thinking about salvation, you think about salvation and how the Bible, how God is trying to tell us what salvation is. And he doesn't just use one thing. He shows us all these different angles so we can better understand and go, oh, that's what it is. And so in some instances, he talks about salvation as being cleansed, like we're washed. Some instances, he talks about it as adoption, about being adopted into a family. In some places, it's redemption. And so it's being purchased from something, like we were a prisoner or a slave. And then, what we're going to talk about Sunday is sometimes he talks about covering our sin with garments. And so all of those provide a picture of salvation to help get us a more well-rounded view of what it is. And the Bible's full of those kind of illustrations. And it's just like you said, it's a picture book for children. So, anybody?
I think if we make sure that we're explaining that to people, that it's not that, the Bible is trying to trick us. That if you attempt to look at it with an open mind and think, okay, this can be a little figurative, but also, checking in different places, and always make sure you're asking questions and don't, completely write off the whole thing as fiction.
Yeah.
Are angels still falling from heaven?
Are they still falling?
You know, the fallen angels that came down and screwed up everything, are they still doing that, or is it fixed now that once they're there?
I can't answer that. I can't.
Well, that's where my mind went.
It would seem that they are, but I can't see that. So I don't know. And we don't have any more new revelation from God. He's told us what we need to know and told us enough to know that there are some that are against us. And that's the thing that I think God wants us to know, is that this is a spiritual thing and that affects things more than we might think it does at times.
Your dad preached a sermon here one Wednesday night, and I was in the nursery, and everybody talked about it for weeks. He talked about us having guardian angels, 2 guardian angels. And I've always wished I heard that one sermon, if I never heard it, and I never did. I would love to know what he had to say about that.
Yeah. And
drinking.
my personal thoughts on that, I do think God has angels that are watching over us. I don't know if we have one assigned to us all the time.
Yeah.
But we don't have to, because if we needed it, yeah.
The good angel, the bad angel, yeah.
I don't know if we necessarily need the bad angel, like, the bad angel, we got that, yeah.
Yeah, we got that part down, how about the,
Yeah. See, in my toddlers, there is no bad angel needed there.
I was listening to the time, like, a lot of times when you have people have questions about the Bible and they're trying to be intellectual about it. No, it's at the end of the time, it's at the end of the day, it's a heart issue. They want to be God. They want to sit on the throne, and anything they do to throw that off, so they don't have to come off that throne, they're going to do it.
Yeah.
So, excuse can be, he killed off everybody in the Old Testament, or the talking, it's just, at the end of the day, it's a self thing. I want to be God. I don't want to relinquish, it's like, again, we talk about because all these TV shows Lynn and I watch and different things we watch about, people are always getting a revenge for something. Who's watching the Midsummer Murders Day? There's wanting revenge on this man's family because their husband got killed. He got, all this stuff. And I said, we see that, and yet then we see Erica Kirk go, I forgive this man who assassinated my husband. And that's supposed to be our calling. That's our command. Which again, I ain't saying I can do it. Just being honest, but
There are times.
Yeah.
that's,
That would take a little more than what I've got, I'm afraid.
well, I go back to that time we did the Voice of the Martyrs missions thing, and that lady talking about that man
Yeah.
whose wife got raped by all those guards, and he looked at him and said, I forgive you. Now,
And I don't think you can discount that sometimes people can say they forgive and then the actual forgiveness comes later, but they're vocalizing, knowing that that's what they should do and what they need.
and they're in that process of going in that
But they're,
direction.
but they're still
Holy
in that
Spirit's leading
process.
What I was gonna say is
It's
like,
not condoning it either.
Right.
a couple of weeks ago, Erica Kirk could have said the same thing you said. I could never forgive that person.
Exactly, when it first
But
said
now they're in that moment and they're having those conversations with the Lord, and she's having those moments in the quiet time with the Lord, and she's finding that.
Yeah.
There's a difference between having that capacity now and finding that in Him.
See, that goes back to Sunday with Tina. When she was talking about when Hunter was in the hospital, and she finally went there into the bathroom and said, God, either way it goes, I know it's going to be good. She said that there's a picture, when Mom passed away, and that first 15, 20, 30 minutes after we were there, Mom didn't want to die alone, so we were there with Linda holding her hand after coming up on the anniversary on the 5th. And see, something you can't explain to people. I can't explain to you the peace that came over. I know it did.
Yeah,
And
it's called peace that passes all understanding for a reason, buddy.
exactly. Because
There's no other way to put that.
there is no words to verbalize it. That it just, it falls on you. And it's, It doesn't stay there, but for the moment you need it. And that season, it's just,
I have more questions about angels, but I asked you after.
All right, so my next one was, if someone asked you about the Nephilim of Genesis 6, how would you summarize different interpretations and which one makes most sense to you and why? And my reason for putting this is because anytime we're studying and we're having conversations like this, and things are new and things may make us uncomfortable, just like with the Revelation study, I think this makes sense. I think this is what the Bible is saying, but I want us to be aware of these other things so you can think through that yourself. Because this is not a close-handed issue. There are things in the Bible that are close-handed issues that we all need to agree on and plant our flags in the ground. Virgin birth, death, burial, resurrection, those kind of things. This is not one of those things. And so it's okay to disagree and say, well, I've heard these other theories and I lean towards this. And so that's why I want you to kind of be able to talk about, well, I've heard this theory and this theory and this theory, and kind of summarize those and be able to come to your own conclusions. So you really don't have to answer this, but that's my purpose in including that kind of a question. All right. Any other questions, comments, those kind of things? You guys all good? You're quiet.
Not talking now. I think Jimmy's taking it.
Jimmy disappeared there.
Hey,
You go in it.
I heard you say something, but I couldn't hear it real good.
What part, all of it? What part did we cut out?
No.
All right. Well, thank you guys for joining us. I hope it's been beneficial and piqued your interest in some things and got us all thinking. So love you guys and see you in a few days.